History is often remembered through the lens of pride. We celebrate flags, battles, victories, and heroes. Statues are erected in city squares, textbooks tell tales of valor, and generations grow up believing in stories of noble sacrifice. But some of those heroes, men painted in gold and draped in honor, hid monstrous secrets behind their polished images. One such man was George Castrioti, known to most of the world as Skanderbeg. In modern-day Albania, he is worshipped as a national icon. His name is synonymous with bravery, resistance, and Christian virtue. Yet buried beneath centuries of reverence lies a legacy soaked in blood, a legacy that includes the execution of 800 children, their severed heads arranged like a macabre crown around his fortress. To understand how this could happen, we must go back to a time when Europe was fractured, when empires rose and fell like the tides, and when religion was both sword and shield. The 15th century was a violent era. The Balkans were caught between two worlds, the Christian kingdoms of Europe and the Muslim-led Ottoman Empire, which was rapidly expanding its reach into southeastern Europe. It was a collision of civilizations, two religions, two powers, fighting not only for land, but for souls. George Castrioti was born around 1405 into the noble Castrioti family, who ruled over parts of northern Albania. His father, John Castrioti, was a local warlord who, like many Balkan leaders, was forced to navigate the treacherous politics of the region. To keep his lands, John had to swear fealty to the Ottomans, a rising force with ambitions of global conquest. And so, in a cruel twist of politics, John handed over several of his sons as hostages to the Sultan, an Ottoman policy known as the Devşirme system. George was among them. The young George was taken to the Ottoman capital, trained in warfare, converted to Islam, and given a new name, Iskender, the Turkish form of Alexander. He was raised among the very people who had occupied his homeland. Over time, he became a respected military officer, rising to the rank of Sanjaqbi, or district governor. He led Ottoman troops in battle, fought their enemies, and won their trust. But deep within him, a fire still burned for the land of his birth. In 1443, after decades of loyal service, George Castrioti made his move. During a battle against Hungarian forces, he defected from the Ottoman army, forged a false edict from the Sultan, and rode home with a small group of Albanian followers. He seized control of the fortress of Cluj, declared himself the defender of Albania, and renounced Islam, returning to Christianity. The rebellion had begun. Skanderbeg's rebellion was not a mere political maneuver. It was a deeply personal war. He had grown up in the heart of the empire he now vowed to destroy. His rebellion would last 25 years, during which he fought off numerous Ottoman invasions, often against overwhelming odds. He became a symbol of resistance, not just to Albanians, but to all of Christian Europe. Popes praised him. Princes supported him. Bards sang of his victories. But there was another side to Skanderbeg, one that history prefers to forget. As he waged war against the Ottomans, he also waged war against those he saw as collaborators, sympathizers, or simply members of the wrong faith. His crusade was not just military, it was ideological, brutal, and deeply vengeful. Skanderbeg understood that fear could be as powerful as the sword. He used terror deliberately, not only to defeat his enemies but to control the narrative. In his view, mercy was weakness, and leniency invited betrayal. So he crafted his legend through blood. Villages suspected of harboring Ottoman support were razed. Men were hanged or impaled. Women were enslaved. And children, those least able to fight, were not spared. One of the most infamous acts attributed to Skanderbeg occurred during a retaliatory campaign deep in Ottoman-controlled territory. After intercepting intelligence that a cluster of Muslim villages had been aiding Ottoman patrols, Skanderbeg ordered a punitive strike. His forces surrounded the area, cut off escape routes, and began the slaughter. Entire households were wiped out. Mosques were burned. Elders were executed in public. And then came the order that would stain his legacy forever. Skanderbeg commanded that the male children of the villages, boys as young as 5 and as old as 13, be rounded up. These were not fighters. They carried no weapons. Many were clinging to their mothers or siblings when the soldiers tore them away. What followed was not a chaotic massacre in the frenzy of war. It was organized, methodical, and symbolic. The children were beheaded. Slowly. One by one. Their severed heads were collected, placed in sacks, and carried back to Cruelty. There, outside the walls of Skanderbeg's stronghold, the heads were impaled on stakes and arranged in a massive circle. 800 in total. To his followers, it was a show of dominance. A warning to those who might betray the rebellion. To his enemies, it was a message carved in flesh: this is what awaits those who stand with the Turks. The perimeter of heads became a spectacle. Some sources say he forced prisoners to walk past it before execution. Others claim he had artists sketch it to spread the image in Europe. Regardless, the message was clear: Skanderbeg was not a man to be crossed. In the Christian courts of Europe, the act was downplayed or ignored entirely. Skanderbeg's role as a defender of the faith overshadowed the atrocities committed under his banner. In fact, news of his fierce retribution against the enemies of Christendom was often welcomed. The same church that wept over the deaths of Christian children turned a blind eye when Muslim children were butchered. It was a holy war, after all. And in holy wars, atrocities become miracles of justice. Yet even some contemporaries found the act disturbing. Venetian merchants who traveled through the region wrote of the ring of skulls that surrounded the fortress. A few foreign emissaries were said to have recoiled at the sight. But their words were drowned out by the thunderous praise of the Vatican and the desperate cheers of a Europe under siege. This was the beginning of a pattern. Skanderbeg would go on to commit other atrocities during his campaigns. Though none would match the scale or horror of the children's massacre, the intent remained the same: terrorize, dominate, and cleanse. Muslim populations were routinely targeted, not just for political reasons, but to send a message that this was not just a rebellion, it was a holy reckoning. Meanwhile, in the lands he ruled, Skanderbeg was building a myth. He styled himself not only as a warrior but as a divine instrument. Churches were restored, religious relics recovered, and monasteries granted protection. He positioned himself as the sword of God, the avenger of Christian suffering. And for many, he was exactly that. The suffering he inflicted was seen as righteous vengeance. But for the families of the 800 murdered children, there was no justice. No repentance. No acknowledgement. Their names vanished from the record. Their graves, if they had any, were never marked. They became shadows in the myth of a man who would one day be called a saint by some and a war criminal by others. This is where the legend begins to fracture. In modern-day Albania, Skanderbeg is a unifying symbol. His name is synonymous with independence, resistance, and national pride. But how do you reconcile national pride with mass infanticide? How do you honor a man whose hands dripped with the blood of innocents? The answer, for many, is simple: you don't. You deny it. You call it propaganda. You say the Ottomans made it up to defame a hero. And it's true, the Ottomans had every reason to discredit Skanderbeg. But they weren't the only ones who told the tale. European sources, some neutral, some even friendly, mentioned the massacre in passing. They didn't linger on it, but they didn't deny it either. What's more chilling is how quickly the horror was forgotten. In the years following his death, Skanderbeg's legend grew. Poems were written. Monuments erected. Even centuries later, during Albania's communist period, he was used as a secular icon of resistance against foreign domination. The image of the warrior remained, but the screams of the children faded into silence. Yet silence is not absence. The bones remain. The legacy persists. And the question still haunts us: what are we willing to overlook in the name of heroism? Terror was not simply a byproduct of Skanderbeg's war, it was a deliberate strategy. He understood the psychology of resistance. When facing a numerically superior force like the Ottoman Empire, brute strength was never enough. Fear had to do the rest. To inspire loyalty among his own people and dread in the hearts of his enemies, Skanderbeg weaponized atrocity. He didn't just fight battles, he orchestrated spectacles of suffering. In several military campaigns, after routing Ottoman troops or suppressing revolts, Skanderbeg ordered his men to leave no survivors in villages suspected of disloyalty. According to accounts from the Venetian archives and travelers of the 15th century, these operations were designed to eliminate not just enemies, but entire communities. Homes were burned with families inside. Crops were torched to induce famine. Women were often raped before being executed. Any child old enough to walk was deemed a future threat. One such campaign took place in the region of Dibur, where local Albanians had allegedly cooperated with Ottoman scouts. After Skanderbeg's forces recaptured the area, the punishment was immediate and total. The men were gathered in the town square, tied to posts, and flayed alive. Women and elderly were locked inside a barn that was then set on fire. Children were dragged into the open, and according to one scribe who accompanied a foreign envoy, their screams were said to have echoed for miles. The goal wasn't merely to punish, it was to engrave terror into memory. Still, Skanderbeg's brutality was hardly questioned by his European supporters. As long as the enemy suffered, the means were justified. Even the Vatican, which had once condemned the excesses of warfare, turned a blind eye to the atrocities carried out by its chosen defender. Papal envoys routinely praised Skanderbeg's righteous fury against the infidels. His massacres were framed as acts of divine justice. But what of the victims? The villagers, the children, the innocents caught between empires, what became of them? Their stories rarely appear in the records. Their names were not preserved. While history carved Skanderbeg's face into coins and monuments, the victims of his terror were reduced to nameless shadows. In Ottoman court documents, vague references are made to the Albanian rebels' slaughter of peasants, but the specifics are scarce. The West, obsessed with crafting heroes, had no space for such inconvenient truths. This silence, however, was not universal. In private letters and obscure chronicles, a different story emerges. A few priests stationed in remote missions wrote home in horror. One Dominican friar described how he had stumbled upon the remains of a razed village, skulls crushed, corpses half buried, and a pile of small bones he could only assume belonged to children. "This is no act of God," he wrote, "but of a man who pretends to be one." Others questioned the moral cost of Skanderbeg's campaign. A Venetian merchant, writing anonymously, asked whether the Christian cause has not been perverted by such bloodletting. But these voices were drowned out by the thunder of drums and the march of armies. War does not reward nuance. It rewards power. And Skanderbeg held it. Even among his own people, dissent was dangerous. Tribal leaders who questioned his authority were branded traitors and often executed. Loyalty was extracted through fear and fire. Those who followed him were protected, provided they obeyed. Those who didn't, even if they were Christian, were made examples of. His rebellion was not only against the Ottomans, it was a purge of any who refused to bend the knee. As the years passed, the line between liberator and tyrant blurred. Skanderbeg's charisma, his skill in battle, and his relentless campaign of fear made him both revered and feared. Songs were sung of his victories, but whispered stories circulated about the screams that echoed from the mountain valleys. Children grew up not only hearing tales of his glory, but also of his wrath. He became less a man and more a myth, both savior and monster. And then came the retellings, the revision of history to suit the needs of emerging nation-states. In the 19th and 20th centuries, during the rise of Albanian nationalism, Skanderbeg was resurrected not as a brutal warlord but as a freedom fighter, a father of the nation. His campaigns were reframed as necessary steps toward independence. The massacres? either forgotten or recast as Ottoman propaganda. In schoolbooks, the ring of 800 children's heads was omitted. In public squares, his statue stood tall, sword raised toward the sky. Albania was not alone in this. Throughout Europe, history was rewritten to inspire unity. Bloody conquests became patriotic struggles. Oppressors became protectors. Massacres were edited out or justified as the cost of freedom. Skanderbeg's story is not unique, but it is especially tragic, for the sheer scale of his forgotten victims. Some modern historians have attempted to revisit this darkness. A few academic texts acknowledge the accounts of mass killings. But these works rarely receive attention beyond scholarly circles. Public interest prefers the hero narrative. No one wants to confront the possibility that their national icon was a child killer. No one wants to admit that freedom, in many cases, was bought with the blood of the innocent. And so the silence persists. The fortress of Cluj is a tourist attraction. Visitors walk its walls, admire the medieval architecture, and pose beside the statue of the great Skanderbeg. Few, if any, are told of the Ring of Heads. No plaque honors the children. No ceremony mourns their deaths. In the heart of the hero's domain, their cries have been erased. But history, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing. The bones remain. The earth does not forget. And somewhere, beneath centuries of soil and myth, the truth waits. As Skanderbeg's rebellion entered its second decade, his tactics became more desperate, and the Ottoman forces more determined. What began as a defiant uprising evolved into a prolonged and punishing war of attrition. Skanderbeg no longer had the element of surprise, and the once scattered Ottoman responses were now replaced by well-coordinated campaigns to crush him. Yet, despite limited manpower and resources, he continued to defy expectations, largely through a relentless strategy of scorched earth, ambush warfare, and psychological terror. The resistance was bolstered by continued papal support. Pope Pius II, recognizing the symbolic power of Skanderbeg's rebellion, declared him the spearhead of a new crusade. Funds, supplies, and mercenaries were dispatched to Albania. In return, Skanderbeg pledged allegiance to Rome and framed his fight as a Christian holy war. The crusade wasn't just military, it was cultural. Artists across Europe began depicting Skanderbeg as a saintly warrior. Writers exaggerated his victories, minimized his defeats, and ignored his atrocities. But not all support was material. Much of it was propaganda. European courts used Skanderbeg as a pawn, a shining example of the Christian struggle, even as they offered him little more than moral encouragement. Meanwhile, the Ottoman response intensified. Massive armies led by seasoned generals marched into Albania. Skanderbeg was forced to retreat, regroup, and rely more heavily on extreme tactics. In this phase of the war, the lines between necessity and cruelty blurred further. Defections from among his own allies were met with swift and brutal executions. One of his own cousins, accused of colluding with the Ottomans, was tied to 4 horses and torn apart limb by limb in front of the people of Cluj. Entire villages suspected of harboring Ottoman agents were annihilated. In one instance, over 2,000 people, many of them Christian but accused of wavering loyalty, were put to death in a single week. Eyewitnesses reported that the executions were staged in public squares, turned into theater. The message was always the same: absolute loyalty or absolute ruin. Some say Skanderbeg even began keeping detailed records of those he executed, categorizing them by age, faith, and reason for death, as if building a ledger to justify genocide. And yet, despite the horrors, the myth continued to grow. Each military success, no matter how small, was amplified. Each Ottoman retreat was framed as a miracle. Every beheading, every pyre, every severed child's head on a pike was buried beneath the narrative of holy war. Skanderbeg, now older and increasingly unwell, fought not just for territory, but to preserve the image he had cultivated. The war had consumed him. He had become both its hero and its prisoner. As the Ottoman tide continued to rise, Skanderbeg's support began to wane. Western Europe, distracted by its own internal conflicts, reduced its aid. Promises from the Pope remained unfulfilled. The people under Skanderbeg's rule, worn down by famine, war, and endless purges, began to crack. Some whispered that their savior had become a tyrant. Others dared not speak at all. In 1466, the Ottomans launched one of their largest campaigns against Albania. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, personally oversaw the effort. Though Skanderbeg's forces managed to repel the siege, the cost was immense. Thousands more died. Villages were reduced to ashes. The countryside became a graveyard of both Turks and Albanians. And among the ruins, the cries of children, orphans, captives, refugees, continued to be silenced. By 1468, Skanderbeg's health was failing. Ravaged by years of battle and burdened by disease, he died at the age of 62. His funeral, according to some accounts, was held in the presence of weeping warriors and foreign dignitaries. Others claim it was a rushed affair, hidden from public view to prevent chaos. Whatever the truth, his death marked the end of an era. But his story was just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the Ottomans quickly moved to reclaim the territory he had held. Within a decade, most of Albania was under firm Ottoman control. The rebellion was crushed. But the memory of Skanderbeg did not die. Instead, it was reborn, remolded, repackaged, and redeployed for generations to come. The myth-making began almost immediately. His followers, eager to preserve their leader's legacy, began compiling tales of his battles, omitting or downplaying the massacres and cruelty. Western chroniclers, especially those sympathetic to the Catholic cause, painted him as a paragon of virtue. The atrocities committed in the name of resistance were reframed as necessary evils or fabricated altogether. And so, the man who ordered the beheading of 800 children became a symbol of chivalry. The warlord who razed villages to the ground was remembered as a protector of the weak. The tyrant who ruled through fear was elevated to near sainthood. In the 16th and 17th centuries, his story became legend. His name was invoked by generals, revolutionaries, and priests. His image was etched into cathedrals and palaces. He became a fantasy, stripped of blood, wrapped in gold. Even centuries later, his myth continued to evolve. During the Albanian Renaissance of the 19th century, nationalist leaders used Skanderbeg as the ultimate example of unity and independence. They lifted him above religion, portraying him not just as a Christian hero but as a champion of Albanian identity. Under communist rule in the 20th century, his faith was downplayed, but his resistance to foreign domination was exalted. Statues of Skanderbeg were erected in nearly every major city. His face appeared on currency. His name adorned schools, stadiums, and government buildings. Not once, in all these retellings, was there space for the 800 children. Not once were the countless massacres revisited. Not once did the cries of the silenced find a voice. This is the power of myth. It cleanses. It rewrites. It erases the inconvenient and sanctifies the cruel. Skanderbeg became what people needed him to be. And as long as the image served a purpose, national pride, religious unity, resistance, the truth could stay buried. But buried truth is not dead truth. It waits. In the yellowed pages of forgotten manuscripts. In the ruins of villages that no longer bear names. In the ancestral memories of those who still whisper the old stories behind closed doors. And someday, perhaps, it will rise again. The silence surrounding Skanderbeg's atrocities is not accidental. It is the product of generations of selective memory, patriotic retellings, and cultural necessity. In a world starved for heroes, especially in the Balkans, a region battered by centuries of occupation, fragmentation, and foreign rule, Skanderbeg became a unifying myth. A symbol of defiance. a face to rally behind. But the price of that symbol was paid by those who never got to speak. In Albania today, Skanderbeg's image is everywhere. His equestrian statue stands tall in the heart of Tirana. His name is given to schools, libraries, and stadiums. National holidays commemorate his battles. Schoolchildren recite poems that portray him as the father of the nation, the protector of the people. And in each of those retellings, the darker chapters of his rebellion, the massacres, the terror, the slaughter of 800 children, remain absent. It is not just Albanians who honor him. In Italy, especially among the Arborish communities descended from Albanian refugees who fled Ottoman retribution, Skanderbeg is revered as a saint-like figure. His portraits hang in churches. His deeds are celebrated in annual festivals. Across Europe, he is remembered not for what he did, but for what people wanted him to represent. And therein lies the great danger of mythologizing history. When a man becomes a symbol, the man himself disappears. His flaws are painted over. His sins forgiven, then forgotten. His victims erased. What remains is a fiction, a carefully curated identity built not on truth, but on need. But history has a way of whispering its truths, even when no one wants to listen. In recent decades, a small number of historians, independent researchers, and human rights advocates have begun revisiting the legacy of Skanderbeg. Not to desecrate a national hero, but to complete the record. To acknowledge that greatness and horror can exist in the same life. That a man can fight for freedom and still commit monstrous crimes. Some of these scholars have combed through neglected Ottoman archives, uncovering official complaints, petitions from grieving families, and administrative records documenting entire villages destroyed under Skanderbeg's command. Others have found corroborating evidence in the writings of Venetian and Byzantine observers, letters and journals that speak of mass executions, burned-out communities, and the strategic use of terror. Even within Albania, a new generation of thinkers is beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Documentaries have surfaced that dare to address the contradictions in Skanderbeg's life. Professors quietly include alternate readings in university lectures. Artists create works that juxtapose the hero's noble image with the suffering he caused. But these efforts remain small, tentative, and often controversial. The pushback is strong. Nationalists denounce these historians as traitors. Government officials avoid the topic altogether. Cultural institutions, dependent on public support and political favor, steer clear of anything that might tarnish the myth. It is as if the ghost of Skanderbeg still patrols the mountains, watching, guarding his legacy. Yet, even if unspoken, the weight of memory endures. In the mountain regions once ruled by Skanderbeg, old stories linger. Oral traditions pass down in hushed tones, tales of mass graves, of wandering spirits, of villages that vanished after a single night of fire and screams. In some communities, older generations still tell children not to play near certain hillsides, not because of superstition, but because too much blood lies beneath. And the children? The 800 boys whose heads were taken, whose bodies discarded, whose lives ended before they could begin, what of them? No names are known. No tombstones mark their graves. No families visit their resting places, because none were allowed to mourn. Their memory is not written in stone, but it lives in absence, in the silence of textbooks, in the omissions of ceremonies, in the shadow behind the statue's smile. It is for them that the truth matters. Not to dismantle a nation's pride. Not to erase cultural heroes. But to remind us that history is not a story of clean divides, of good and evil, right and wrong. It is a messy, painful, human thing. And if we are to grow as societies, we must find the courage to look at our past in full, not just the parts that make us proud. Skanderbeg was brave. He was brilliant. He was a tactician, a leader, a man who fought against overwhelming odds and dared to challenge an empire. But he was also ruthless. He believed in fear. He used terror as a tool. He murdered children. And that, too, is part of his legacy. We can honor resistance without forgetting its victims. We can admire courage without denying cruelty. We can hold up heroes without turning them into saints. The 800 children deserve to be remembered. Not because they changed the course of history, but because they were part of it. Their lives mattered. Their deaths were real. And the world they were born into, the world that allowed a man to build a legend atop their corpses, must be held accountable. In time, perhaps, their names will be rediscovered. Perhaps a memorial will be built. Perhaps schoolchildren will learn not only of the battles won, but of the lives lost. Perhaps a statue will be raised, not in bronze or marble, but in honesty. Because in the end, truth is the greatest monument we can build. In the modern age, history is no longer the exclusive domain of kings and conquerors. It is interrogated, challenged, re-examined by scholars, citizens, and even algorithms. In this climate of re-evaluation, the stories we once told without question come under scrutiny, not to dismantle legacies, but to make them more complete. Skanderbeg's legacy, too, must be weighed, not erased, but understood in full. Across the Balkans and in diasporic communities, discussions are growing louder about how national heroes are presented. The internet has enabled suppressed histories to surface, sometimes from dusty archives, sometimes from whispered family memories passed down over generations. A new generation, less tethered to state-sponsored mythologies, is beginning to ask, who gets to be called a hero? And who pays the price for that title? The story of the 800 children has begun to re-emerge, not in national museums or textbooks, but in forums, independent documentaries, and social media threads. Artists paint haunting murals, filmmakers craft quiet reenactments, poets write verses that name the unnamed. Though still marginalized, the narrative is gaining ground, one voice at a time. Some educators have taken bold steps. In classrooms across parts of Albania and Kosovo, younger professors introduce Skanderbeg not only as a liberator, but as a case study in how power, faith, and fear intersect in the forging of national identity. They do not diminish his accomplishments, but they refuse to whitewash his crimes. It's not revisionist history, it's restorative history. Meanwhile, government institutions continue to resist change. Funding rarely goes to historical research that challenges foundational myths. Cultural ministries remain loyal to the sanitized version of Skanderbeg's story. Tour guides still speak of the fearless knight who protected Christendom, never of the children whose heads lined the roads to his strongholds. But even in these places, cracks have begun to show. In private conversations, even officials acknowledge the growing pressure to adapt. Internationally, the academic community has been more receptive. Panels at historical conferences now debate Skanderbeg not just as a figure of resistance, but as a study in the duality of leadership. UNESCO reports on cultural memory have cited the need to contextualize monuments. Western historians increasingly call for truth plaques at celebrated heritage sites, small inscriptions that tell the full story, not just the glorious one. Yet, these movements are not without backlash. Nationalist commentators accuse critics of betrayal. Online trolls threaten authors and filmmakers. Older generations, taught only the myth, often recoil at the suggestion that their hero committed mass murder. They fear that acknowledging Skanderbeg's atrocities will unravel the very fabric of national pride. But truth does not unravel, it reshapes. To acknowledge a hero's crimes is not to destroy them, but to reclaim them as fully human. And to remember the victims is not to weaken a nation, but to strengthen its moral core. What would it look like if Albania honored both sides of Skanderbeg's legacy? If next to every statue, there stood a plaque for the fallen children? If the stories of resistance were told alongside the stories of those silenced by that resistance? If national identity could be founded not just on glory, but on accountability? It would be uncomfortable. It would provoke outrage. But it would also be healing. Because the question of Skanderbeg is not just about him. It is about us. About what we value. About how we teach. About the kind of history we leave behind for the next generation. Will it be a fairy tale, or will it be the truth? We owe it to the 800 children to answer that question. We owe it to ourselves.